I'm delighted to see so many people here today. This is a great turnout for the first one. And as this is the first of hopefully many more workshops, I'll briefly outline what we envision the Joan Robinson workshops to do. So we would like to emphasise the interdisciplinary roots of economics, which are sometimes overshadowed in the Cambridge course here. But we also want to try and recreate some of the Cambridge tradition of the last century. We want to reconnect the field with its original philosophical and political understandings. So today we're first going to hear from our speaker, and then we will have a Q&A after. So if you have any questions already, please hold them until after the talk. So with that, I'm delighted to announce our first speaker and welcome him today, Professor Nuno Martins. So Professor Martins specialises in economics and philosophy and teaches the history of economic thought, social philosophy and ethics at the Portuguese Catholic University in Porto. So he's also a Cambridge alumnus and a member of the Cambridge Social Ontology Group. As the author of the influential book, The Cambridge Revival of the Political Economy on the Cambridge Tradition, and publishing the paper in the special issue of the Cambridge Journal of Economics on Joan Robinson, Professor Martins is the perfect first speaker for our inaugural event. So, Professor Martins, thank you for coming, and we look forward to your talk.
So, good evening, everyone. I would like to start, of course, by thanking Sophia for such a kind introduction. Thank the Joan Robinson Society for inviting me to be here, especially Adonis, who has been an incredible host. And it's an enormous honor for me to be the speaker for the inaugural Joan Robinson Workshop, which is organized as part of the GirtonTalks, which are on the theme on a more just world. And that's a theme that Joan Robinson would certainly approve, because that was very much what she was concerned with. And it's also fitting that it takes part in the internet, that the talk occurs in International Women's Day, because she was one of the most outstanding women economists in the 20th century, or in any century. So I'm going to talk a little bit about her and about her approach to economic theory. And the point I would like to focus on, especially in the later work, because in the later work, she was sometimes seen as being somehow nihilistic, somehow someone who had given up on economic theory. And what I want to argue is that she was not really giving up on economics. She was just looking for a more solid basis for what she saw as a possible reconstruction of economic theory, which would have been a revival of what she saw as the approach of the classical political economists. So that's the main topic of the talk. So the starting points, Sophia was mentioned in the Cambridge economic tradition. And Joan Robinson, she was a Cambridge economist, and when she started, of course, like most Cambridge economists, she was very much in the Marshallian tradition. And Marshall used to say that Henry Sidgwick, we have the Sidgwick site right here, Henry Sidgwick was the person that Marshall used to call his intellectual father and mother, and then he was succeeded by Pigot. And at the time, in that approach, there was also a concern with fairness and justice in the economy, but it was done through a marginalist framework using marginal utility and the so-called neoclassical framework as a way to achieve that. So all students of economics learn that marginal utility is a decreasing function of income, right? And so what they were arguing is that because people with more income have a lower marginal utility for that income, redistribution of the income through taxation subsidies sort of increases overall utility. So there were normative implications coming out of economic theory. Now, these normative implications of economic theory, this concern with a greater redistribution and more equality, kind of started to disappear from economic discourse after Lionel Robbins, who was at the London School of Economics at the time, criticized this approach by saying there can be no such things as interpersonal comparisons of utility. So using utility as a basis for assessing well-being sort of was put into question. And for example, Amartya Sen's work on the capability approach was very much concerned with trying to bring a space for assessing inequality, such as the space of capabilities, that was not subject to the same problems as utility. So this was the scenario. So economics was stopped being was sort of becoming a more positivist science, less concerned with ethics and with inequality. And Joan Robinson was critical of this state of affairs, and she engaged in several debates with neoclassical economists to try to bring another view of economics. And perhaps I cannot focus on all of them because I only have 1 hour, and I will actually ideally like to spend more than that to have more time for questions. So I will focus only on what is perhaps seen as the key debate, or the most famous debate, which was the Cambridge controversies in the theory of capital. And what was she arguing then? In the Cambridge controversies, she was arguing against a solution to distribution that was being put forward by John Bates Clark, although she saw it as a vulgarization of Marshall. And the point was that you don't really have to discuss ethical or political issues connected to distribution, because distribution can be determined mathematically by looking at the marginal productivity of labor, the marginal productivity of capital, and so by looking at the marginal productivities of the factors of production, you determine mathematically distribution. And by doing that, you no longer have to bring these ethics or political issues into economics. And there is an interesting manuscript by Straffa when he's looking at things like utility or the production function as the key tools of neoclassical economics and seeing where should I start to critique. And Straffa says something like, utility is a very subjective phenomenon, which is the same critique that Robbins had made to the Cambridge approach, as I said before. And whereas with production, you can focus on more objective things as a basis for the critique. So that's where they went, and that's what Joan Robinson ended up doing. In 1953, she published a paper criticizing the production function and sort of bringing to the public debates these Cambridge controversies and the theory of capital. And what was the point? The point was to try to show that this marginal productivity theory, this method for determining distribution, was not correct. And the argument, very briefly, is that you cannot find an aggregate measure of capital without knowing first the distribution of income, because the distribution of income will give you a certain cost of production that will determine the value of capital. So you cannot measure the value of capital independently of the distribution of income. Now, what's the conclusion that she reaches with this? What's the point? The point that was reached after this by him, by her, and by Straffa was that distribution is exogenous from the point of view of economic theory. So from the point of view of economic theory, there is no way that you can set up distribution mathematically, which means that it leaves the distribution open to be seen as determined by other forces. And the forces that she was seeing as determining the distribution were political and institutional forces. So this kind of opened the way from going, as she said, from economics back to political economy. So we will no longer have this view of economics where distribution sort of disappears from the picture, and we focus only on production and consumption using production functions and utility functions. We just leave this view and go back to political economy, which is a view where economics is a field pervaded by normativity. Now, here we must understand that there was a clash between two visions of the economy that were at stake. So what were the two visions? I have some, can perhaps put, and just with a very rough scheme here to understand. So the two visions that were at stake in the controversies was the neoclassical vision, which argues that has as a starting point utility. So you start from utility maximizing agents. These agents engage in exchange, and they engage in exchange in a situation where you have scarcity. So because you have scarcity, the reason you have scarcity, it's because you are always maximizing your utility. So if you always want more, everything is scarce. And that's the definition of economics that you learn today. You learn that economics is the science that studies the allocation of scarce resources which have alternative uses. Now, the alternative vision she was arguing for was a vision where the starting point is not utility, but rather labor, as in Adam Smith's classical vision. So the contrast was between the neoclassical vision and the vision of the classical political economists, which had also been developed by Marx. And in this alternative vision, the starting point is labor, as with Adam Smith that starts with the division of labor. And you start from studying production, but the key point is that when you workers engage in production, they produce a surplus. And the key question in political economy under this vision is not the allocation of scarce resources, it's rather how the surplus is distributed. Because it is the way the surplus is distributed that will shape the dynamics of the economy. And this is something that goes back to the physiocrats. So the physiocrats, for example, were arguing that the surplus, which for them was the rent in agriculture, should be argued in productive ways rather than in unproductive ways, which it's something that Adam Smith picks on in his distinction of productive and unproductive labor. So what is this alternative vision? Instead of having economics as looking at agents that are optimizing given resources under scarcity, and finding this equilibrium, you have a dynamic vision where you are studying the economy in terms of how the distribution of the surplus influences the economic dynamics. And how does it happen? It depends on whether the surplus is used for productive purposes or for unproductive purposes. And then you are led to different political ideologies depending on how you decide the surplus should be distributed. That's why she claims that you go back from economics to political economy. For example, Smith and Ricardo, this is just an example, they thought that landlords typically waste the surplus in luxury consumption. So the surplus should go to the capitalists so that they could reinvest. That will be the liberal view, so to speak, and to the workers, of course, although the surplus is defined as what is left after the workers receive the wages. Malthus, on the other hand, thought that landlords had a useful function to fulfill, which was to absorb excess supply. So he thought the surplus should also be distributed to the landlords. That's a more conservative view. Marx, on the other hand, thought that in the future we will have mainly these joint stock companies where the owners are not doing much. So the surplus are not doing anything. So the workers are the only productive force. So the surplus should be distributed only to workers. What's the point I want to illustrate with this example? Is that you have this scheme of classical political economy of focusing on the distribution of the surplus as the key analytical question in economics. But from this very analytical scheme, you can reach different political ideologies depending on how you decide the allocation of the surplus. If you think you should allocate the surplus to landlords, capitalists, and workers, you are adopting a view more akin to Malthus, which is a more conservative view. If you are saying the landlord should receive no surplus, only the capitalists and the workers, then you are in a liberal view. And if you say only the workers should receive the surplus, you are in a socialist view. So the distribution of the surplus, and this is something that Straffa also saw, focus on economics, not in terms of marginal productivities, but in terms of the distribution of the surplus, opens economics to the space of politics. And why is that? Because when you have distribution determined by marginal productivities, when you have that, it's just a technical issue. It's a mathematical issue. There is no politics involved. But by the moment that you decide that the distribution of the surplus is the key question in political economy, because it now became political economy, then when you do that, you will be led to different kinds. Politics is inevitably involved. And people working in political science sometimes claim that conservative liberalism and socialism are the key political ideologies, and they can all be conceptualized under this framework. So that's where she argues that we're going back from, from economics to political economy. But why can we do this? Why can we claim that the distribution of the surplus is a political question? Because she reached the conclusion, theoretically, that the distribution of the surplus was an exogenous aspect from the point of view of economic theory. And so when she says it's an exogenous aspect from the point of view of economic theory, then she can argue that it's determined by some other forces. And this is also connected to the distinction that Marx made between what he called vulgar economy and classical political economy. Marx argued in an argument that was influential for Straffa and also for Joan Robinson that we had to distinguish vulgar economy, which focused on supply and demand, from classical political economy, which was going to the deeper causes that are behind supply and demand and are the deeper causes that cause supply and demand to occur in a certain way. So you have to look at the overall mode of production. You have to look at how labor is producing a surplus, and that's the underlying framework that you need to look at if you want to have a more scientific approach, which was Marx called the classical approach, albeit criticizing it for being ahistorical, instead of going to the marginalist framework, which will be just at a more superficial level. And Joan Robinson showed in the Cambridge controversies, to conclude, just to summarize, her conclusion was that distribution is not determined by marginal productivities, it's determined by outside forces. Which forces can those be? They can be political forces, and that's how she can bring normativity back into economics. But now, not using the Marshallian framework that she was using before, not the framework where marginal utility was the argument for redistribution. Now she's bringing it using another vision, which is the vision of the classical political economists and Marx. And that's why Jeffrey Archer used to emphasize that the key question at stake in the Cambridge controversies was not so much these technical issues, but it was the clash between these two visions. The visions where your starting point for economic is utility maximization, driven, and then all these utility maximizing agents engage in market exchange under scarcity, versus the case where you focus on labor producing a surplus. So it was these two visions, the classical vision and the neoclassical vision, that were the real clash. And the other part, which is important, is that she thought, after the Cambridge controversies, she didn't fully adopt Sraffa's system. She was also very influenced by Mikhail Kalecki. And the thing is that Sraffa was focusing on the influence of distribution on value, but she thought that distribution also influences effective demand. And that's something that she thought Kalecki got right, but was absent from Sraffa. And she says that until the very last papers. So what's the structure of the argument so far? So she was moving away from this view where you have utility maximizing agents as the core of economic analysis, which is what we have today as the core of economic analysis as it thought. And she was seeing that distribution is not something which is endogenous, that is not determined by the theory, but it's rather a determinant of what happens at the level of value and at the level of quantities. So prices and quantities, these things that we tend to focus on economic theory, cannot be studied without studying distribution first, because it is the distribution of income that leads to a given value and leads to a given level of effective demand. So you have to study distribution first. And if you look at distribution, that's when you're looking at the deeper causes at the more scientific level that Marx was also trying to look at. But now the question is, and how do you study distribution? What are these forces that you need to study in order to understand distribution? Well, this is what Joan Robinson used to call the rules of the game. So she used to say that when you are studying a given social system, you must start by understanding what are the rules of the game. And the rules of the game are essentially the rights and obligations as structure the social system. That's what she was aiming at as the deeper part you need to study, the deeper causes you need to study, rather than going just to the more superficial phenomena of prices and quantities. So you could not even start understanding prices and quantities before you went to the deeper causes, the rules of the game, and the study of the overall system. And here we can compare perhaps two conceptions of order. So when you are in this conception, the kind of conception of order that you achieve is a conception of order where the market is the key to the organization of economic activity. Why? Because you are starting from utility, but you want to know what is the utility. To find value, you must find the subjective utility of human agents. But how can you find subjective utility if it is something in people's mind? Like Joan Robinson was saying, you cannot compare, observe it. How can you find subjective utility? Well, you need a market so that people engage in exchange in the market, and by exchanging in the market, they reveal their preferences, and by revealing the preference in prices, then you have a market order, which is pretty much the Austrian argument, for example. So that's the kind of order that you find by focusing on the market and prices and quantities as the basis for structuring your theory. And what she was arguing was that you have to go deeper than this to find the rules of the game that structure these very markets. And to do that, you will have to move from this idea of a market order to what you may call a normative order. That is, you look at the rights and obligations that structure the rules of the game, and this kind of normative order expresses the power relations, because the power relations, of course, are defined in terms of the rights and obligations that lead you to study a given social system. So, for example, she was studying when she was studying developing economies, she was often comparing feudalism with capitalism, or when she was looking at socialist economies in the 20th century. That's the moments where Joan Robinson really goes to look at the rules of the game. And the rules of the game are defined differently, so the normative structure of rights and obligations is defined differently in these various social systems. For example, in capitalism, according to Marx, for example, capitalism will be a system where the workers no longer own the means of production and sell labor power, whereas feudalism, for example, is a system where the workers still have the means of production but have the obligation to pay rent to the landlord, which can be rent in kind, rent in money, or it can be also labor services in the lord's domain. So these are different structures of rights and obligations. We see discussions today of some people arguing if we are going back to feudalism, for example, or techno-feudalism, as Yanis Varoufakis argued more recently. And the question here you have to ask is, well, are we changing the rules of the games that are closer to that? Is it the fact that we now own means of production again, say our computers, to work with? And is it the case we are paying some kind of rent in kind, paying services, fees for streaming services? Or is it the case that we are giving things such as our data? These are interesting questions to ask. What kind of system are we living in? Is it still capitalism? Is it still something else? But you cannot address these deeper questions about social systems before you question the rights and obligations which are the structure of the normative order, which is the kind of topics we have been studying in the Cambridge Social Ontology group with Tony Lawson and the other members who are here. So what I'm claiming is that when Joan Robinson gets to a very famous paper called Spring Cleaning, when she gets to that paper, a common interpretation of that paper is to say, well, at that time she just became nihilistic. She didn't care about economic theory anymore. She just said, let's scrap the lot and start again. And the interpretation I'm giving to that paper is that what happened was not that she got nihilistic. What happened is that she realized that that much of economic theory had been focusing on the more superficial phenomena, had been focusing on this market phenomena and trying to focus on prices and quantities and utility and exchange under scarcity. But by doing this, economics was not being sufficiently scientific. And to be truly scientific, it had to find the underlying causes that are behind these more superficial phenomena. And the underlying causes, which are the causes that lead to a given distribution of income, that's where she starts in the Cambridge controversy, saying we have to focus on a different approach that has a distribution of income as something exogenous. What she finds is that what she calls the rules of the game, that is the normative order of rights and obligations as I'm interpreting it, as I am interpreting her concept of rules of the game, this is the more basic structure that you need to study first before you understand the rest of the economy. And you may say, well, but to what extent? So this is not nihilism then, this is just going to another approach to science. Here we can raise the question of what science is, because in mainstream economics, it's often argued that mainstream economics is more rigorous. It has mathematics, it's more rigorous, but it is somehow less relevant to contemporary problems. And one argument one could make is to say that Joan Robinson was aiming for more relevant policies or theories than the ones we found in mainstream economics. But my argument is not exactly that one. My argument is that mainstream economics is not even rigorous. Because the point to be rigorous is not the same thing as using mathematics. You can use words and write a text and be very rigorous in the way you're writing things. In fact, the fact that you use words may allow you to keep, as Keynes used to say, at the back of your heads, your various assumptions. So when you do a mathematical model in economics, typically in mainstream economics, you have a lot of unrealistic assumptions. Why do you need them? Because for the model to work, you need to construct a closed system. That's why science worked in physics. Mathematics worked in physics because you have closed systems, either in astronomy or because you construct them in a laboratory and you get a closed system so that you can measure structures, powers, mechanisms, tendencies more exactly. That's how science works. But in economics, you cannot close people in a laboratory, or if you do, as you do more recently in this experimental approach to economics, people know they are in a laboratory and you are not sure they're going to behave exactly in this way a particle works in a lab. So the point is that in economics you have open systems, not closed systems. So if you are going to try to use very precise mathematical models, you are going to have to introduce so many assumptions to close the system. And many of those assumptions are highly unrealistic. So what I will argue is that that's not being rigorous. That's being highly unrigorous, because you are introducing things which are not really, how can you call rigor something which is separating yourself from reality? And even from the point of view of Joan Robinson, her claim was that the neoclassical models were not rigorous because she proved, together with Schaffer, in the Cambridge controversies in the theory of capital, that there were logical and mathematical flaws in the model. So the idea that mainstream economics is more rigorous, in my view, is a myth. Joan Robinson showed it was not in the Cambridge controversies, and still, the quantities of assumptions you see today, that's not a rigorous approach to science. What science does is to look for structures, powers, mechanisms, tendencies behind the events. That's as critical realism argues, as and Tony has been arguing in Cambridge for many years in the realist workshop. That's what science does. And if you want to be scientific and rigorous, that's what you must look for. Not trying to skate over the surface, trying to measure things that are always and permanently changing. And this is what Keynes calls in the general theory the difference between using ordinary discourse in a rigorous way or just blindly manipulating mathematical symbols without knowing what you're doing. So what I would argue then is that when Joan Robinson claimed that we must scrap the lot and start again in the spring cleaning paper, she was not being realistic about the possibility of economic science. She was just finding that if you want to have a truly economic science, you must find it at another level. And the level will be the level of what she called the rules of the game, this normative structure of rights and obligations. And that's when she says that perhaps all we need is something like Schaffer's system. But if you look at Schaffer's system, it's something very minimalistic. It doesn't have much in it. Actually, if you look at it, the only parts which are a bit more mathematically complicated are like the standard system, the standard commodity, and these are things that Joan Robinson say, we can ignore all of that. It's not worth a candle. That's the expression she uses. So she takes only a very simplified approach, just looking, but all she wants the structure of the analysis to have is the idea that distribution is exogenous from the point of view of economic theory, and it's distribution that shapes then prices and even quantities when you go to the Kaleckian approach. And that distribution must be found, as I was saying, in the normative structure of rights and obligations. So the spring cleaning paper leads, I think, to a more rigorous and relevant approach to economics. So that's why I was saying my argument is not that we need a less rigorous but more relevant economics. My argument is that we need a more rigorous and relevant economics, because you cannot find rigor without actually going to an analysis where the kind of methods you use are well suited and adapted to the nature of the reality that you are studying. And so instead of saying it's a nihilistic paper, I would say it's a paper that captured well the needs of a radical reconstruction of economic theory. And this is something which I think is very relevant even today. Because today we have several problems. We have Joan Robinson in her days, she was talking about development, poverty, inequality, and these kind of problems. And we have today another problem, which is the ecological problem too. So the challenges that we have today to reach a more just world, as it's the theme of these conferences, is how can we solve social problems within the ecological boundaries? And if you have a theory that claims that human beings are always maximizing their utility, that's just a non-starter. That's just a starting point for disaster. Because what you're saying is that human beings will always want to maximize. But if they always want to maximize, that is a theory that presupposes that people always want to be outside the ecological boundaries. And more than that, it's measuring value in terms of subjective preferences. For example, in environmental economics, you have many natural resources you don't know the price of because they don't have a market. In neoclassical economics, you find prices by looking at market exchange because it's in market exchange that value gets revealed in prices. And what do they do in environmental economics when they don't know prices? They just ask, how much are you willing to pay to preserve for these natural resources? They're trying to find how much is the natural resource valued in terms of our subjective preferences. Now, the problem is that biophysical processes don't care about our subjective preferences. So if you have a theory where you organize a theory on the basis of utility, you are already separating the theory from a more realistic analysis of the underlying not only social structures but even biological structures that we need to address to solve social problems within ecological boundaries. So that's already a problem. And you can say, well, what about scarcity? Isn't it the fact that the theory focuses on scarcity a helpful thing? Because scarcity seems to be an ecological problem too. Well, but the way that scarcity is constructed in this version, in this version of the theory, it's actually in a trivial way. You just assume that human beings are always maximizing utility. And because they're always maximizing utility, of course everything is scarce, because they always want more. And if humans always want more, then of course everything is scarce. Whereas in the classical approach, the starting point is the distribution of the surplus, but taking into account that scarcity exists. In the case of natural resources, for example, and that's why they produce a rent, as the classical economists argue since Ricardo or even before Ricardo. So, if we want to address social problems within ecological boundaries, topics such as how the surplus is distributed and what are the rules of the game are absolutely essential topics to be addressed if you want to have a theory which is relevant for these kind of problems. I don't think that the theory that starts from the point that human beings are always maximizing actually will work or will be helpful. And in fact is also quite unrealistic, because a starting point of mainstream economics is that human beings are always acting in a sort of maximizing kind of behavior, optimizing. So it sort of says that human beings are always selfish in a way, of course there are more sophisticated elaborations of utility functions where people just have consistent behavior and whatever is consistent is rational. Although then you can ask, as Amartya Sen did, is it something that is consistent, necessarily rational? What about if you always choose the things you like the least? Is that rational? But the point is that we have this idea that human beings always want to maximize, always are sort of selfish. But if you think about it, and this is something that Tony has also worked on, and Adonis is also working on, called critical ethical naturalism. I will not go into that, but I will just say, imagine that people are always being selfish all the time. Can society really function that way? The only reason people can be dishonest is because there is someone honest to be fooled. The only reason lying works is because someone will trust you. Because if people don't trust you, lying doesn't work. The only way you can break the traffic rules is only if everyone else is following the traffic rules. Then when you are on the road, you see someone breaking the traffic rules, you kind of think, well, everyone is just selfish. But what you don't notice is that that person is the only person that's doing that. Everyone else is following the rules, and that's why traffic is functioning, and that's why the person who is breaking the rules can break it, because everyone else is following it. So I don't even think this is an adequate characterization of human behavior, because if it was that, society would not last for a day. So, and it's quite irresponsible to be teaching this to people, because it kind of promotes the kind of behavior that you would want to eliminate if you want to solve social problems within the ecological boundaries. So let me make then a summary of what I said, and I promised to finish before 6 so that we have time for questions, so I'm still trying to fulfill that promise. But what's the point? So what was Joan Robinson trying to do? She wanted to reach a conception of economics which was more relevant for the social problems, but she thought that economics was a political science, not just, it was political economy and not just a technical science. What's the way she found to try? She tried to communicate with mainstream economists. She didn't just go say, well, I'm going to do my own theory and ignore what the mainstream is doing. I'm going to try to argue with them that they are wrong. And what's the point of attack she chose? The production function. In my view, probably at Straffa's advice, because Straffa was at some point considering which way to go. Amartya Sen, for example, went for an attack on the utility function by saying that preferences are not complete and these kind of things. But Straffa thought the production function was the more intelligent point to start a dialogue with. And so she was arguing the production function and this idea of distribution determined mathematically is just incorrect. And she proved it was correct. Even Paul Samuelson admitted that their solution was correct. But, of course, he argued we could somehow reshape neoclassical economics to incorporate the results by keeping it a technical science. But after engaging in this dialogue, she reached the conclusion, as Straffa did, and Kalecki also had done, that distribution is not something that can be explained mathematically. So it's just a political process that explains it. So we have to go to the rules of the game. What are the rules of the game? In my interpretation, we can see it as the normative structure of rights and obligations. And this kind of structure, which is what in the Cambridge Social Ontology Group has been done under the heading of social positioning theory, I regard as the more scientific approach because science is about going to the structures of how things work. But when physicists are studying, they are not just doing models, they are looking at atomic and subatomic structures. Chemists are looking at molecular structures. Biologists are looking at organic structures or cellular structures. Many biologists don't even use maths, like Darwin never used any maths to explain evolution, for example. So mathematics can be very useful in the cases where you have closed systems, or can be very useful for descriptive statistics, calculating the GDP. So there are, of course, uses for mathematics in economics, and no, Joan Robinson will be far from saying that you cannot use mathematics in economics. The point is not the use, but how it is used. And her point was that it was being used in contexts where it was not really helpful anymore. But the people who could not see or conceive of an economic science other than mathematical could not react to that in other way than saying, what? So no mathematical models, so this is just nihilism. We just abandon everything. But the point is not to abandon everything, it's just to go to the deeper level of structures, which is what all scientists do. And that's what needs yet to be done in economics. Because if you don't do that, we will not reach a theory that is capable of addressing social problems within ecological boundaries. Because to address them, you need to look at these underlying structures, forms as the surplus is distributed, implications it has. For example, the classicals were arguing against luxury consumption. Is that an ecological problem too? But is it the case that you only focus on more and more and more productivity, which is what the classics encourage? Also a problem because you're producing too much. So these are all the questions that you can raise. But my point is that you cannot address these problems without changing the level of analysis at which you ask questions. And my claim is that the level of analysis that is being undertaken in current state of economics is a very superficial level that does not go to the underlying structures we need to study. So before we do that, we don't have a scientific approach to economics, and we are unable to address the social problems we have in a proper way. And without doing that, we will never reach, there is no good wind for someone who does not know where is she or he is sailing to. So the claim is that if you want to have, if you want to go to the project of addressing social problems within ecological boundaries, you need a radical reshaping of the way economics is conceived, and you have to go to this study of normative rights and obligations. Some could say, but is that economics? Isn't that also sociology, history? Don't all social sciences do that? Then you must ask to what extent is economics a separate science or just a branch of a more general social science? But that's a more general question, and one that Joan Robinson, as far as I know, did not address. But certainly you need more interdisciplinarity. So that's the points I wanted to raise, and I thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That was really great. There should be a microphone floating around
There is one here.
somewhere. I'll find some. Does anyone have any questions? And I'll bring the microphone back to my cheek for those times. Anyone start us off?
I'm hoping you can hear me without the microphone. Are we doing it for recording? Okay, so thank you first and foremost. But how are we to draw the line for where maths is useful within economics? Because I think we could draw the line at, well, where does the sort of the underlying ontology of maths approximate the ontology of the systems we are analysing? So where are they closed and atomistic and so on? But there seem to me theories within mathematical economics that offer useful insight without approximating that ontology. So as an example, we learn, I'm a third year economist here, we learn Ramsey's theory of optimal taxation, which, Keynes called the most inspired contribution to mathematical economics. And that seems to me like, well, it has something to offer, but clearly taxation on a nationwide basis does not approximate that ontology with that maths supports. So where do we draw the line there, or how do we explain those outliers?
Yes, thank you for the question. Keynes was the editor of the Economic Journal, and he was very supportive of Ramsey publishing that paper that in 1928. And the paper, well, the way you draw the line, but Keynes also sort of has the answer to that. So sometimes you build a model, and then you use the model to shape the narrative you want to construct. So you have the model, but after you build the model, then you manipulate the mathematical symbols, and they help you construct a narrative, tell a story about the world. Now the question is that story helpful and realistic or not? Because you could do otherwise. You could start from the narrative and then incorporate. This is what Fred Lee, for example, suggests we do. You incorporate or include mathematics in your story only to illustrate particular points, or even to have a scheme of analysis, but it does not constrain the narrative that you want to tell. So these are two different ways of using mathematics. So which is the more helpful one? Well, if you have a relatively closed system, then the model may help you to think about things. Because, you see, Joan Robinson also had this idea. She had said something like, I hope not to be inaccurate, but it was something like, I don't use too much mathematics, therefore I have to think, something like this. Because if you use mathematics, the mathematics sort of does the thinking for you, right? And Keynes says the danger is when you start, as Keynes wrote in the general theory, when you start blindly manipulating symbols. You are manipulating the symbols, but you are unaware of the real economy which is behind it. And that's where the danger of mathematics is. Now, but if you can construct a narrative where you incorporate statistical analysis or whatever that is helpful to illustrate the narrative, then probably that will be a useful way to bring mathematics in. In fact, Keynes was a promoter and behind the founding of the Department of Applied Economics, where he thought we could use mathematics in a useful way to bring some statistical analysis that will be helpful to understand the economy. So Keynes was not criticizing mathematics per se. He was just criticizing certain uses of mathematics. And the key criteria is, to what extent are you blindly manipulating mathematical symbols without thinking about the economy? Or to what extent are you actually thinking about the economy and it's helping you illustrate things? My claim and my experience when I was studying economics as an MPhil and PhD student is that much of the times the symbols are used in a way that we get lost in them and start just manipulating them and start to losing touch with reality. That's the danger. If that happens, then we should take a step back and kind of look at the reality we are analyzing. But that's the key. Do you have a narrative that mathematics is helping illustrating? Or are you just blindly manipulating symbols which are shaping the story, making it lose connection to reality? That's the criterion I will use to draw the line, if that was helpful.
Okay.
Thank you. So I guess the rough way I understood your talk, so just to sketch it out in case I'm wrong about this, is that you've got these kind of rules of the game, and that's the kind of underlying something fundamental. And then from those, you can generate your idea of distribution. And then from the distribution, then you get your price and quantities. And the price and quantities come out at the end. And the problem with neoclassical economics, in part, is that it takes these price and quantities as lower level than you think they are. So I guess I had kind of questions about both of those transitionary moves. So in the first one, I wasn't exactly sure on how the rules of the game end up impacting the distribution, because it seems like I could specify rules of the game as just these kind of abstract rules of a system, and if I tell you that, it doesn't tell you like how much anyone in the system has, or like whether some people in the system have much more than others, or anything like that, right? So I mean, you know, in kind of toy economic examples, you have situations where people like own companies and then they work for the companies, and it just doesn't tell you much to know like the roles that people are playing unless you know something else. So I guess I was a little bit unclear on how we were supposed to get this idea of the distribution from the rules of the game. And then in the second transition from distribution to prices and quantities, I only did a third of an undergrad degree in economics, but in that, it did seem like there was some awareness or emphasis on the way that these could relate to each other. So like a classic kind of undergrad exam question is like, okay, person A has these things, person B has these things, person C has these things. This is their utility functions. They enter a free market. What does everyone come out with at the end, right? And then you say, oh, well, what are the prices these goods get traded at, and how much quantities of these goods get traded? I mean, is this? I suppose that if that seems like something that is being taught even within quite neoclassical based degrees, what do you think needs to go further in the internalization of that kind of information? Why is that not sufficient? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Those are very good questions, and your summary is perfect. You should have told me that before so that I could use your summary of what I said. Can you hear me? Is the microphone working? Okay, good. So the first question, the rules of the game. How do you go from the rules of the game to distribution? The rules of the game are, this is my interpretation. It's actually not entirely my interpretation. The first person to say this was A.V. Cohen. A.V. Cohen was a scholar of Joan Robinson. He still is a scholar of Joan Robinson. I learned about Joan Robinson first through Jeff Arkert, who was here at Cambridge. Then I went to read A.V. Cohen. And A.V. Cohen he has a paper where he suggests that we interpret Joan Robinson rules of the game in an equivalent way to which Tony, who is sitting here, Tony Lawson, talks about social rules. So that's the paper by A.V. Cohen where he says that, and that's where I sort of drew the idea originally from. And so from there, I went to interpret rules of the game in terms of rights and obligations, because A.V. Cohen was focusing on his previous work, and now the Cambridge Social Ontology Group has moved to another way to conceptualize the normative order. So I was sort of updating A.V. Cohen's idea with the more recent form of Cambridge Social Ontology. That's what I was doing. And if you look at the rights and obligations, how they shape distribution, it's things like this. For example, in feudalism, you know that you have very strict rights and obligations. So the serf has to pay rent in kind to the landlord. If he is lucky enough, because sometimes they claim this is some sort of privilege, he can make what they call the commutation from rent in kind to money. But that brings a monetization of the economy that then can have some type of other implications. And he can also have to go to perform direct labor services in the land that belongs to the Lord. Well, all belong to the Lord, but he has rights to work on particular lands. So this is an example of rules of the game. Or in capitalism, for example, you receive a salary, but then how much you work, it depends on how much effort you put in your work. That's why Marx says you sold your labor power, and you receive a wage that allows you to reproduce your labor power. But then your question is, but how do we go from this characterization of rights and obligations to the exact distribution, to the quantification of how much the wage is or how much the profit is? That's the part where we'll need statistical analysis, as I was answering your colleague. That's the part where you need to know, well, what is the average wage in a capitalist system? Although Straffer, for example, thought that we should go the other way around. He thought that the interest rate set by central banks was actually the key determinant of profits. It was because the central bank, by setting a certain interest rate, has a very large influence on the financial system, and that sort of influences how distribution is going to take place. So you could kind of quantify the interest rate very easily by just assuming that whatever is the money rates of interest, as Straffer was saying, then leads to a determinate solution. But part of my point is that science is really about the characterization of the structure. And the quantities that you then reach in terms of wages, profits, or in what is the final rate in kind or money, these are things that you can study through statistics to try to learn more about the structure, but are things you should not hope to be able to measure very exactly. So you can try to measure as exactly as you can, but the real part which is scientific is the study of the structure of rights and obligations. That's the part which is scientific, and the other part is just something that you can look at. For example, when historians are studying the transition from feudalism to capitalism, people like Maurice Dobb, who was here in Cambridge and talking with Joan Robinson about these things, and he had this debate with Paul Sweezy, they were kind of looking at, sometimes they would look at quantities just to try to infer what kind of rights and obligations were implied, but the point is really to see when was it the case that quantity becomes quality, that the system is changed. So I would say that you'll start from the rights and obligations logically to explain the system, but when you want to study the system, sometimes you have to do the reverse order. This is what the Latins used to say, the difference between ratio essendi and ratio cognoscendi. So the difference between the nature of things, going ontologically from the basic ontology and then to see how the structure of rights and obligations produces what you are observing. On the other hand, the epistemological problem is to sometimes to look at the quantities and try to infer what kind of structure might be behind it. And that's what scientists do. And now what I was claiming is that economists, instead of doing this kind of approach, very often just lose themselves in the quantitative relations without really going back to the structures, which is what scientists would like to do. So that would be the first part of the question. Is this helpful or... Okay, good. So the second part, you gave the example of the Varesian example, and that's a good example because I remember Jeffrey Arkert, when we were talking about the Cambridge controversies, he said, there will be a very easy solution for neoclassical economics. It will just to abandon aggregate capital and just use general equilibrium theory. Because in general equilibrium theory, you have disaggregated capital, and the problem of capital aggregation does not occur anymore. So general equilibrium theory, as you were saying, will be a more consistent system that we could use for studying the economy. There were various lines of arguments against this. One is by Pierangelo Garignani, who argued that even Vargas tried to reach the idea of a general rate of profits, which sort of made the Varesian system inconsistent. But of course you can say like Frank Hahn did, and say, well, let's just ignore the general rate of profits and just make the system consistent. My take on this is just to argue that using utility as a basis, that the assumptions of general equilibrium theory are just too unrealistic. You just have to assume that people are maximizing their utility, and if you go to the Howard de Breuer version, you have to know that they know exactly how much they want to buy in X years' time. So, and that's the part where you start to lose rigor, in the sense that you might have the formal model complete, but you starting to detach yourself too much from reality. And those were the criticisms that the general equilibrium theory also received, when people start to see that excess demand functions could have any shape whatsoever, and so you will not have this process of tendency towards an equilibrium. So if you look to the Straffer system or the general equilibrium system, the Straffer system is something which sort of embodies the things which are on your right-hand side. You have labor terms, you have a production system. The book is called Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities, and you have a surplus produced. The general equilibrium theory is exactly the other way. You start from exchange of given things under scarcity, and agents are maximizing their utility. That's the part where I think the most useful thing is to do what Amartya said it and attack the utility function, to see that the problem is that the utility function has various problems in the sense, and this is something actually we must be fair on this part, that mainstream economics have been acknowledging. All the developments in behavioral economics have been an attempt to deal with the problems of the utility function. Of course, another problem arises to the extent that they try to do that with the same methods that you're using. But so from that, your second question is also very interesting in the sense that it's exactly what many people thought at the time. And in the Cambridge controversies, actually, there was a third round where it switched from the focus on production function to general equilibrium theory. That was exactly the answer that was given. We can just solve all of these things with general equilibrium theory. But with general equilibrium theory, I think the problem is that then you have to resort to a highly unrealistic conception of human behavior, as even mainstream economics recognize, to sort the problem. So I'll rather be with Joan Robinson's use of Strauss's system as something still more realistic. But the point is well taken, because that's exactly what happened. It moved to general equilibrium theory. But why did not the debate continue much more after that? Because it was mainstream economists themselves who started to question general equilibrium theory, and so the debate did not continue on those terms. More questions, if there are any.
Just bring us a moment.
Okay, so the other thing I wanted to ask about is the discussion you had about selfishness and the idea that agents are fundamentally selfish, and I guess because it just seems to me that the obvious response from the neoclassical person to this is, well, if you're a selfish agent and you can see that if you act selfishly, then, everything's going to end tomorrow really badly, then you won't act like that because it's in your self-interest not to do so. And then, that's then you can kind of come back. But you might get some kind of dialectic where the person, any answer you give, which makes it in the agent's self-interest not to act selfishly, is something that a self-interested agent could absorb and then act on as a selfish agent. And especially if you think they're like a rational utility maximizing agent, then they definitely will do that according to neoclassical theory. So I suppose I wonder if the critique of that, would need to come from a different place.
Yeah, that's an interesting point too. I mean, I can imagine many game theorists, for example, saying, well, we can have a game theoretical framework where norms emerge out of strategic interaction, and this kind of part of the norms will be to behave in a different way so that society doesn't end tomorrow, and that's how game theorists explain things. The problem with that, however, is that if you start from a game theoretical perspective, you are still assuming that people develop these norms because they thought about it. Whereas if you look, this is something that Amartya Sen writes in a book, 1987 book called Ethics and Economics, where it says the strategy of game theorists is typically to put defects in people's knowledge so that they will not follow the dominant strategy, such as in the prisoner's dilemma, whatever is the dominant strategy, and they will then, with these defects of knowledge, then behave in a way that society doesn't end tomorrow. Another approach is in evolutionary game theory, where they just say that, or when they have this sequential equilibrium, and they say when there is a sequence of equilibriums, then in this dynamic game theory analysis, they kind of reach a situation where stability sort of emerges at the point where people cooperate like this. But the question is it really because people are thinking like that, or do they just act like that? I mean, if you go ask, when people are following these norms, are they really thinking, I must do this because if I do this, then things will work better? Is it a realistic explanation of behavior or not? I mean, but this is something that even many economists have been trying to incorporate altruism and things like that in their explanation. So, and the thing is that you get to this type of situation where you say, I'm doing this because you are doing that, and then I'm doing that because you are doing that, and then you are doing that because I'm doing that. It goes on forever. And it never gets to a sense that we are just doing this, which seems to be a more realistic and more direct explanation than just trying to infer everything out of individualistic interaction. But that will lead you to ontology inevitably. An interesting story is that, before, metaphysics used to be a compulsory subject for students, and it was Marshall who decided it shouldn't be, but William Cunningham, who was an historian, thought metaphysics should be compulsory for two reasons. First, because he thought we could not understand science without understanding the nature of the objects we are studying, and the second one is because he thought that we cannot understand society without addressing the question of whether people are social atoms. He said monads at the time, he was using the word monads, or whether people are relationally constituted. So he thought metaphysics should be compulsory to understand these things. So the question here that we are asking is ultimately whether we can have an explanation where we start from individualistic ontology as if human beings were social atoms and can derive through strategic interaction norms, or whether norms are there from the very beginning and human beings are relationally constituted. So that will also probably imply some study of our various subjects, how the brain works, for example, how the brain reacts. There are people saying we have something called mirror neurons that just react automatically to things and generate empathy, which was what Adam Smith called sympathy in an almost automatic way. So you will need more evidence, but I think the question, then your question now is ultimately ontological. Is society constituted by individuals who are strictly independent from each other and just reach cooperation through strategic interaction? Or are human beings relationally constituted from the very beginning, which is the point of view of critical ethical naturalism? And of course you can have one view or the other, but I don't think I can in 5, 10 or 15 minutes fully answer that question, but that's the question we will have to deal with at that stage. Yes, please.
Thank you. In one of your papers regarding Joan Robinson, you discussed the difference between historical time and logical time. I was hoping you could expand on that a bit, especially in regards to the implications for economic analysis, its normative implications, and within kind of a framework that discusses rights and obligations, discusses atomized individuals and relationality, and how the difference in that study affects stable equilibria and economic analysis in general.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. I actually wanted to talk about logical time and historical time, but I looked at time and it was nearly 6, so I thought I should not. But since you asked the question, now I can say what I was going to say anyway. And you see, logical time, it's something difficult to grasp in the sense that it sort of means, in some sense, the absence of time. So when she talks about logical time, the idea is time being reversible. So you have a mathematical model where you can go forward in time and back in time. And when general equilibrium theory, for example, changed from the approach of Walras and Pareto to John Hick's approach to general equilibrium theory, there was this idea of intertemporal equilibrium. So you have an intertemporal equilibrium path you follow, and things are taking place in time, but it's a time which is just mathematical. And the thing for Joan Robinson with historical time is that time brings inevitably uncertainty. Time brings uncertainty, so when you have time introduced in the model in historical time, it's not reversible. Things happen and you cannot just reverse as if you have a closed system where you can just adjust things the way you want. By the way, talking about John Hick's, that's why he ultimately found the ISLM model as a problem, because he invented the ISLM model in the 1937 paper, which was sort of summarizing Keynes' theory. But then he realized, and he wrote that in a paper in the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, that if you have liquidity in the economy, that means you have uncertainty, because that's why you need liquidity, because you are uncertain. By the moment you have uncertainty, you cannot have these exact curves, such as the LM curve and things like that. So he said the ISLM models perhaps is just a useful tool for starting macroeconomics, but then soon to be abandoned. And the problem is always, and this was recognized by John Hicks himself, who was the creator of the ISLM model. And you could actually make tell several stories of economists who then abandoned ideas that they produced and are still taught today, but that's another topic. But with historical time, it's just, in my view of it, it's just a case where what Joan Robinson says is that time is not reversible. She has a quote by Henri Bergson, the French philosopher, who has quite an interesting approach to time. And Bergson takes this in terms of closed systems and open systems. So with historical time, it will be kind of an open system where things are not reversible, where in logical time will be kind of a closed system where you can reverse things. And of course, you could have people wanting to build a mathematical approach to this with non-linearity and things like this, but that's not what Joan Robinson was saying. So what Joan Robinson says in the spring cleaning paper is that the Strata system, without the complications, without the standard commodity, without the standard system, just the very basis of it, the things which are on the right-hand side of the board, it's all you need. And after that, you just start analyzing history. And that's what takes place in historical time, which is non-reversible. And so I will take the difference to be essentially one between whether you just have reversible time in the mathematical models, that's logical time, and versus the case where time is not reversible because you have an open system. That's what I think she was aiming at. Perhaps you could say it's more useful to talk in terms of open systems and closed systems, and because if you say historical time, well, isn't history something that already has time in it? So, of course, what you want to mean by this is that I want to talk about a fictitious approach to time, which is the time of mathematical models. So I think that's what she was aiming at, and the spring cleaning paper is ultimately about finally taking historical time seriously, because Marshall was, for example, in general equilibrium theory, you can't just have time absent at some point if you want. You can't just have a static approach of the economy. But Marshall wanted sort of to have it both ways. He wanted to have diagrams of supply and demand, but instead of a general equilibrium, he wanted to have a partial equilibrium analysis so that he could combine it with a narrative and have a bit of historical time too. So he wanted to have logical time in the supply and demand curves, but also a bit of historical time in it. And I think what Joan Robinson realized at some point is that we cannot dodge the question anymore. We must just reject the notion of logical time and fully embrace historical time, and that means adopting a conception where we cannot use the same kind of models we have been using and must have a simpler approach of reality from a mathematical perspective, which is, however, a more rigorous and scientific one. So, but that's the part, but she used the notion historical and logical time even before the spring cleaning paper. And at that time, she just meant logical time, mathematical models with reversible time, historical time. It's the case where there is no reversibility and you are outside the models in the real world. That's what she meant at that time.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. Yeah, my question is more about sort of the broader treatment of economics. So,
sorry, what?
More about the broader like treatment of economics.
The broader treatment.
Yeah. So, in terms of your criticism of economics, in terms of the use of mathematics and the assumptions you mentioned, we saw a lot of criticisms about economics as a subject back in the 2008 crisis with the use of like the real business cycle, the efficient market hypothesis, and there was a general consensus that these models had sort of failed. So my question is, why do you think economics has not changed more despite these crises and despite these sort of realizations? And what do you think is needed for economics to become more rigorous, in your opinion?
Yes, another very good question. What happened is that economics, well, the consensus at the time amongst mainstream economics, economists was that economics had to be more realistic. But by more realistic, they meant essentially analyze more empirical data. But the way they had to analyze empirical data was through the same methods that they were using before, because they had no other methods to use. So the solution to the 2007 and 8 crisis was to claim for a more empirical approach to economics. So instead of talking about microeconomics or theoretical microeconomics, you talk about empirical microeconomics. Instead of talking about theoretical macroeconomics, you talk about empirical macroeconomics, and so on and so forth. But what kind of models are you using when you do this? well, the only ones you know how to use, because otherwise you are being nihilistic. You are just rejecting the theory you have. So I think the reason why economics didn't really change much is because they kept using the same models, but claiming that now they were more realistic, because now they were applied to reality, but without having a very rigorous assessment of the models. Because I can tell you, for example, if you talk to someone from the natural sciences and you see their statistical inference, they would say something like the kind of statistical indicators we have for the economics models will not be accepted as rigorous in their sciences because the model is not close enough. I remember once having random regression as an MPhil student and talking to someone who was from chemistry, and she started laughing, and I was, why is that? All the dots are outside the line. And I was like, what's that? Because you are supposed to have the dots all aligned, and then you find the regression line which goes through all the dots. And they said, well, that's in your science, not in mine. So, the thing is that if you want to have a rigorous approach, you will probably have to look at the way the models are being applied and assess to what extent are they really helping or not. But my assessment of it is that you had mathematical deductivist models used theoretically and sometimes empirically in econometrics, and the change is to say we have to go more empirical. And that's why it didn't really change, because you are using the same methods, and deductivism is exactly the same technique, whether it is applied to theoretical data or to empirical data. The question is has it been successful? Well, I haven't found much evidence of success, but if I'm open to persuasion if someone finds it. And what will be taken to change more this state of affairs? As I said, instead of seeing the rejection of the persistence in these methods as nihilism, just realize that the more scientific approach is to try to find the underlying structures, as I said, the normative structures of rights and obligations and structured power relations, and then see to what extent this quantitative analysis is helpful to find that, like the example in feudalism or in capitalism, when you are calculating this statistical data to see the extent to which, for example, interest rates are stable and to what extent we have what's a general rate of interest that exists across economies or not. So these are kind of questions that you can then ask. But I think the reason why things didn't change is because people came under the illusion that they were now changing to being more empirically driven, but with the same methods, the change was more illusory than real. I don't know if this was helpful. Yes. Okay, thank you.
I actually have a question just following on that point, and then I'll come
Sure.
to you, Alex. Do you not think that the mathematical side of the models is so ingrained within how the whole of society operates, how the whole banking system works, how everyday life works, when you go to the supermarket or something, that actually not to necessarily reform the whole thing, but to even just change the foundations from which economic theory works, it's kind of a bit unrealistic, because it's so ingrained in every way the society is kind of formed and developed, that to try and change it now, it may be too much of a change or too demanding, and we can only do it so many years down the line, at which point we might have found a better way.
Yeah, thank you for the question, because that helps me clarifying something that I would have wanted to say. What you're saying is that people behave, there is quantification in society, right? Which is something different from using mathematical models to measure things and to study society. Another thing is the fact that society engages in a lot of quantification because we have prices, quantities, and we operate on the basis of it. And that's what people from the third generation of the German historical school, like Max Weber or Werner Sombart, used to call the rationalization of society, the emergence of a calculist attitude, which they think is the key characteristic of capitalism. So, for example, for some people, like people from the Annales school, the French Annales school of Brodel, capitalism is characterized by the existence of intermediaries. So instead of having producers going to the market to sell their things, you have intermediation, and that's where capitalism emerged. So the more distance there is between the producer and the consumer, the more capitalism you have. For Marx, capitalism happens when you people sell their labor power because they no longer own the means of production, and that's where capitalism begins. But for the German historical school, or the third generation at any rate, and Werner Sombach and Max Weber, capitalism emerges when society becomes more quantified, or quantification occurs, and people structure their relations in terms of quantification. And that's a feature. Well, I'm not going to ask which school, the Marxist school, the German historical school, or the French analyst school, has the best characterization of capitalism, But I'm surely think that quantification, of course, has been occurring. So it's a very important question. But one thing is to say that quantification has occurred in society. That you can measure with statistical tools. That's the kind of mathematics which is actually useful, because it helps you to understand how society works. The different thing is when you start to measure things. This is a point that Straffa also makes. He has nothing against the measure of things that exist, objective quantities. The problem is when you start to measure things that you are not sure, even things like subjective utility. How do you measure subjective utility? Then you are, or how you measure parameters in a model you invented, and you are not even sure the parameters exist in reality. So that was the distinction. So this kind of mathematics, which is already ingrained, that has to do with the fact that society engages in quantification. And that's a part which is important to study, of course. I'm never meant to say that's not an important thing. And the quantification of society in itself is an important theme, because it's a different way of organizing social relations in which they became more abstract. And so people just engage in more anonymous ways with each other because it's just about exchanging money and paying prices and these kind of things. That's a part which is important to study, of course, and it's a topic in itself.
Thank you. My first question, perhaps a little bit silly, is what's the scope for genuine reflection on the rules of society, given that our conception of the rules are shaped by the rules themselves? So are we able to be genuinely self-aware, or are we able to just provide rules that stem from the rules themselves? And the second question is that given we can identify rules, how do we change the rules? If rules are just embodied in action and people don't think about them, is there scope for changing rules? I suppose what I'm trying to say is do we change it by changing the superficial level and hope the rules follow? Or do we change how do we change the rules?
Yes, you see, of course that's not a silly question, but you see, there is no such thing as silly questions, only silly answers. So I'm the only person who is on the risk of saying something silly, not you. But the question is a very interesting one. It has to do with our self-awareness of rules. We are in an International Women's Day. So many years ago, people will find normal that women will not go to school, and people will find normal that women will just stay in the house cleaning and doing all the housework, and the husband will do nothing. And that was just the rules of the game that everyone was accepting. And then at some points, people start to gain consciousness of this, and process of changes occur. So of course you have moments, and of course even with this happening, it can take a long time, and people can be unconscious about this process for a long time. And sometimes it's not everyone who is aware. Only 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 people become aware and can start the change. So of course it's a very interesting question. So if we are working under these rules, how can we step outside to question the rules? So these are the moments where the prejudice which is ingrained in society starts to be questioned. And even the use of mathematics in economics is something like that. Because you have this belief that science is mathematics. But all you have to do is to realize that science is about studying structures. And mathematics is sometimes helpful and sometimes it's not. Or sometimes it gets in the way. Because it's when you have cases of open systems. So the way you identify the rules is essentially sometimes by getting surprised by something. So you are acting normally, but something surprises you and makes you think. You see, in mainstream economics, you define rationality as acting according to your preferences. Amartya Sen actually has a different definition of rationality, which I always found useful, which is to say, rationality is your capacity to scrutinize your goals and values. That means rationality is not acting according to your preferences, is your capability to think about your preferences, to rethink things. So it's the capability to step aside and think a little bit more about what your preferences are. So these are the moments where you identify the rules. And then you have the second stage, which how do you change them? Well, about economics, that's what we're trying to do, right? So it's not easy, but the part of changing, it depends on what is your political strategy. I don't think changes should happen coercively, so I think it must happen to persuasion. So I think it's ultimately about talking to people, and yeah, eventually you might have a brilliant idea of changing the rules, and then you talk to people and you realize you are wrong. You realize that the approach you had was not the correct one. That's why democracy is important, not only for ethical reasons or for it's not only a matter of legitimacy of everyone participating in the decisions, it's also an epistemological question, because it's by talking to people that sometimes they generate the knowledge that you need to change things. So the process of change, in my view, has to be a democratic process of discussion and talking to people and trying to persuade them that your approach is more reasonable than the other ones. And sometimes by talking to them, you might realize that perhaps your approach was not as reasonable as you thought it was. So I don't know if this was of any help, but yes. Okay, good.
Ask a follow-up question.
I would ask some follow-up to that. I suppose what I was trying to get at with the second question was that, so say in America, some sort of participation in democracy has led to the consensus that there should be more equality between races, but you're not able to disseminate that belief effectively amongst the population. So what you have is affirmative action that changes the incentives or changes the structure at the superficial level so that you can change the rules of the game. If you then develop a good understanding of the superficial level, that's the most effective means by which to change the rules, rather than, what's the difference between changing the rules and changing the superficial level and then the rules change subsequently? And therefore, if you could change the superficial level to change the rules, mathematical economics, the study of incentives and how people respond to them in a simplistic way, could be useful for changing the rules.
Yes, you see, my distinction between this deeper level and the level of events, so to speak, it's just an analytical distinction I'm making here to help making the argument. But of course, in reality, things are complex. They are all mixed up. So of course, you act at what I'm calling the superficial level. But what I'm saying is that the only way to be conscious of the change you're causing is if you understand the deeper level and you kind of understand what kind of structural changes you are causing. So if you have that understanding, then things will go well. The problem is not acting at the superficial level. The problem is being unaware of the existence of other level. That's the problem. So I have no problem with what you're saying as long as you say that we are conscious of, you're conscious of what are the underlying level that you are trying to change.
You spoke earlier about the need for interdisciplinary work, especially in this area, and I think that's a major part of what, especially the Cambridge Social Ontology Group, really stands for. And I come here as a historian, so something that's obviously less grounded explicitly in what people call science or whatever. But why has mathematical modelling not just been persistently applied in economics, but also in political science or for example, cleometrics in economic history, or in other words, why is kind of closed model mathematical taxonomic conceptions of science so pervasive across the social science? Is this just fashionable, or is there a different reason for this?
Well, it is the tendency for mathematization. It's something which is, well, Tony has a paper on it explaining how the last chapter of reorienting economics is explaining the expansion of the mathematizing tendency. And the history that Tony tells, as far as I remember, is that it starts in the United States in the McCarthy era, where things which are more mathematical are seen as more politically neutral. And because they are more politically neutral, then it creates an environment where they are more easily acceptable than things which are not politically neutral and seem more politically dangerous in the context of the Cold War. Then what happens next is that the American universities become reference for the whole world in terms of science. So everyone starts to copy what happens in American universities, including Cambridge now, which was before some sort of resistance placed to this expansion in the times of Joan Robinson and even before. So, but the reason why this happens, so this is just the historical context in which it started. But then you ask, but why does it continue? What's the driving force of it? I think the driving force of it is the belief that science, to be rigorous, has to be mathematics. Without mathematics, it's never rigorous science. That's the belief. And I think the way to change it is to show that science is rigorous when it correctly identifies underlying structures. And mathematics may be useful for that or not. And so what we're seeing in those sciences is the expansion of the methods of mainstream economics to other social sciences in what is sometimes called economics imperialism, in the sense that the methods of economics are like colonizing the other social science. Cliometrics, of course, and quantitative economic history is the field where it happens. And when you say that in history, you don't necessarily have connection to science, and I understand that happens in many historical conceptions, and perhaps rightly so. But for example, the analysis school of Brodel, they had some idea that they were searching for some kind of scientific approach to the study of structures, because they wanted to go below the level of events to the longue durée, to the long-term structures, and that was called New History at the time. But then afterwards it appeared what it was called New Economic History, which was this quantitative approach of cliometrics, and they started to see the analysis school as something less rigorous. But if I go read Brodel or the earlier people, Lucien Febvre, Marc Bloch, I find they are much more rigorous than whatever came afterwards with cliometrics, which is just trying to apply models without even an adequate characterization of the historical, you need historical categories in order to do your analysis. They may be more or less appropriate, but you need some kind of historical categories just to start going, just to start your analysis going. And when you start to concentrate on the cliometrics, I think you really lose what I sort of gave up reading them at some point, because I felt it was not rigorous. So but the short answer is, it's the belief that science has to be mathematics, when science has to be the study of structures, which can help. And mathematics may be useful. The analysis school uses a lot of mathematics. They were pioneering, actually, the use of data at some point. But one thing is to do that. The other thing is just to have these formal models where you invent things that don't really exist, so that will be the key difference. But yes, I think the process of economics imperialism is underway, and that's another way of reaching interdisciplinarity, which is imposing the methods of mainstream economics to all the other social sciences. I would rather prefer a method where economics also learns from the other social sciences, and in a way that can generate a geohistorical social science grounded on geographical and historical contingencies, but trying to build from there to find the underlying structures.
So my question's a bit more on history of economic thought kind of thing. So Keynes himself has a bit of a tension with the classical school. In my interpretation, he had read Straffa before the general, well, 20 or maybe 30 years before it comes out, but also critical of much of the Marxists in Cambridge at the time, so on. But my question really is, in that context, obviously the precise focus of the general theory is somewhat removed from the social reproduction, Straffian element that Joan Robinson thinks is going to hold everything together. But do you think that in that moment of the revolution of 1936, as it were, it implies a final evolution of economic thought towards the theoretical consensus, theoretical point which Joan Robinson had reached in 1982 or whatever, or was it still a contested project at the time? And which ways, if it wasn't contested was it contested within Keynes's thought, as it were, and which ways would lead on to that? I know his work on uncertainty or the methodology itself. In other words, did Keynes know himself the revolution that his work brought about, and Robinson's thought and so on?
Yes, well, Keynes. The thing with Keynes is that Keynes was very Marshallian in methods. So Keynes was trying to find a case where we have equilibrium below effective demand, below full employment, sorry. So the point of effective demand becomes below full employment. And that's why Joan Robinson at some point thought that Kalecki's principle of effective demand was more easy to reconcile with the vision of economics she wanted to advance, which was the classical political economist and Marx, because Kalecki was focusing on the distribution of the surplus, and he was drawing on the Marxian reproduction schemes, whereas Keynes was sort of engaging in a kind of equilibrium analysis. But she always tried to rescue Keynes and the principle of effective demand and say, well, Keynes would have gained much more if we will recast his theory in terms of the classical political economists rather than in the Marshallian approach he wanted to characterize. Further confusion is added by the fact that Keynes uses the term classical in a different sense that Straff and Joan Robinson use, because Keynes was a student of Marshall, and Marshall wanted to give the impression that he was in sort of continuity with the classical political economists. So he was in continuity with Smith, Ricardo, and John Stuart Mill. That's what Marx was arguing. But when the term classical political economy was invented, it was invented by Marx to distinguish the people that go from William Perry until David Ricardo from the people who come after, who are the vulgar political economists. What's the difference? The classical political economists are the ones that look at the process of production, the mode of production, so the deeper causes, which Marx thinks is a scientific endeavor. Just the only problem is that it is ahistorical. That's the problem for Marx. They think that the classical political economists, they think that the same system, social system, will last forever. Now, the vulgar economists are the ones that look at supply and demand, not curves, because there were no curves at the time. It was first with Augustin Cournot and then Marshall popularized the supply and demand curves. But they look at supply and demand without looking at the deeper causes that cause supply and demand. And that was how Marx framed the term classical political economy. Now, what happened at some point is that people start to use the term classical political economy to designate not only the people that Marx was talking about, but also the ones they called vulgar economists. And so you redefine classical political economy, instead of being the period from William Perry to David Ricardo, you go from Adam Smith to John Eliot Keynes. So you have Malthus in there, you have lots of people that Marx would have seen as vulgar economists in there, but they are engaging in supply and demand analysis. That was the big debate between Ricardo and Malthus. Malthus thought that supply and demand is the ultimate source of value, whereas for David Ricardo, supply and demand, like for Adam Smith, are just superficial phenomena, that accidental things that deviate the market price from the natural price, but the natural price will be studied in terms of the cost of production. So Marshall thought that we should go to supply and demand analysis, and by supply and demand analysis, we will then reach a systematic explanation. But that was more Malthus' approach than really Ricardo. So that was more what Marx called vulgar economy, rather than classical political economy. And Keynes, of course, was talking to Straff. So when he starts the general theory, he say, I'm using the term classical to mean just everyone, like Smith, Ricardo, but also Marshall, Pigo, Edgeworth, everyone is in there, even the marginalists. And he says, I am aware that people usually use the word classical to mean just the people up to Ricardo, because he talked to Straff, and Straff must have told him that. That's the more plausible explanation that why Keynes puts that in a footnote at the beginning of the general theory. But Keynes framed the analysis in terms of supply and demand and equilibrium. But because for him the classicals was just assuming full employment all the time, and for him the change was simply to have an equilibrium below full employment. And Joan Robinson said, well, the conclusion is correct, so Kalecki and Keynes reached the same conclusion through different ways. And Joan Robinson said that's very reassuring that you have different methods and reach the same conclusion. It means the principle of effective demand must be right. But I would rather use Kalecki's framework rather than Keynes. That's what she says most of her career. Although in the spring cleaning paper she mentions no Kalecki, she mentions Keynes. And I think it's to do because she wants to reject much of mathematical models, and Kalecki was more mathematical than Keynes. So at the end she goes to Keynes and Straff for a combination rather than Kalecki. Although for most of her career she was more of a Kaleckian, of course, and then she would have thought that that was the more appropriate way to go. I don't know if this answers the question. It does. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Well, in today's world, because the models that we have are so ingrained, as has been said before, ingrained in how people
behave, but they are aware of that model that they've been taught, but they're not aware of the rules of the game that they live in. So wouldn't those models, to the extent that expectations shape reality, wouldn't those models still retain some usefulness for economists that live within this paradigm to predict what people will do, because it is a sort of religion for that shapes what we do? Does that make sense?
So what you're saying is that because many people behave, so for example, central banks perhaps when they are setting a monetary policy rule are following models like this. And if you understand the model, you can predict better what the central bank will do. Is this something like this you are implying?
And all the investors, when
yes,
something happens, they'll...
Yes. Well, to the extent that they may be following this, it may be a common language that helps them to think about things. So, but then you see, the model is not really a tool for economic analysis, is rather an object of economic analysis. You see the difference? It's a bit like when your colleague Sophia was talking about quantification. It's like one thing is to say, I have this model which helps me understand reality. Another thing is to say, people are using this model, I will just study how they behave, and the model becomes the object of analysis. And even when you are criticizing mainstream economics, you are taking the models as object of analysis. Everyone does that, yes. Because you can take them as an object of analysis for criticizing them, or you can take them as an object of analysis for trying to see how the people who are using it behave. So that's something you can do, of course. But it doesn't imply that the model automatically becomes legitimate as a tool of analysis. It's just an object of analysis, which is something different.
All right, if nobody... Okay, last question then, and then we've got some time just for like general discussion.
So at the centre of all the economists' visions you've presented is the idea of reproduction and of surplus as a result. Amongst the physiocrats, say, the notion of surplus is very clear in its physical realisation, in that you must retain X percentage of the grain this year to plant again next year. And then in Marx, it again has a sort of fairly simple physical representation in that the factories must produce a certain amount of capital machinery to continue the factory line. In today's economy, sort of where do you see the reproduction actually happening? And I suppose in that it's become removed more from an obvious physical representation, to what extent does that harm its use as a tool of analysis?
What, the last sentence I didn't understand, sorry?
So today, say, the physical...
I just didn't get the words in the last sentence. You can just repeat it.
So the physical representation of reproduction today is much less clear.
Okay.
Where do you see it happening, and to what extent is its fuzziness a harm to its use as a tool of analysis?
Yes, Straffer actually said that Ricardo's focus on agriculture was helpful in the sense that in agriculture you can identify the surplus much more easily than if you go to industry and services and other kind of things. So, and in fact, he claimed that there was a degeneration of the notion of costs. So, for example, for Petty, he would focus not only on labor time, but actually on the quantity of land that you need to sustain the laborer that works for a given quantity of time. Because he was looking at the food and the ways of maintaining the laborer and the quantity of land you will need. So land will be like the more objective thing. And then you move from land to labor. You move from the quantity of land that you need to sustain the laborer to actually the labor time. But Straffer claims this is just a proxy. This is just something that we use to approximate the quantity of land because it's easier to measure labor time rather than land. If you want to find this kind of analysis today, if you want to see William Petty, for example, when he says in the 17th century how much land you need to sustain the labor, isn't kind of an ecological footprint or a carbon footprint or a material footprint. So this kind of ecological concepts kind of tie in well with this more physicalist approach, physical representation of the surplus. So of course, as you say, it looks difficult in today's economy to find this because everything is measured in terms of utility. And because everything is measured in terms of utility, utility and subjective preferences are something which is difficult to measure, and everything becomes fuzzy. And that's why I've argued in several papers on ecological economics that perhaps this more physicalist representation of the surplus will be a good way to try to tackle economic problems by seeing more clearly how the surplus is produced and distributed. So it implies some change in the way you address value. So it implies going back from this measurement in terms of utility to this earlier kind of measurement, which is more difficult to observe today, but you have several people trying to calculate planetary boundaries, ecological limits, material footprints, carbon footprints, which sort of approximates the type of conception of value that the earlier classical political economists had when they were focusing on agriculture. So all the methods you can find to try to address these problems, that will be an example of a more useful way to use mathematics to try to see what kind of problems we are having. But then you don't stop there. You have to look at the structures which are causing this. And you have to study the biological structures that produce this, but also the social structures that lead to the kind of human activity that has certain impacts in the biosphere that lead to these kind of consequences. So it's not an easy task, as you say, because we are not living in a very simple economy where we can just observe everything in agriculture, but we must find a way of tracing the social and ecological impacts of supply chains. If we don't trace the ecological and social impacts of supply chains, we don't even know what the ecological and social impact is of anything what we are using. For example, I don't know how this phone was produced. Who produced it? I don't know how this clothes was produced. We lost completely track of how everything is produced. We just buy things. We just find the finished products to be exchanged. And we forgot about production, which is the point where we're supposed to start from. So I don't think we can address any of these problems without having a greater knowledge and awareness of how supply chains work. And with that greater knowledge of how supply chains works, then you can perhaps try to measure these effects more adequately, but still I don't think we can reach perfect measures. You just have some statistical indication of our impact, but the point is always to go from there to the structures. Good.
Okay, thank you so much. It was really interesting, and thank you so much everyone for the great questions. I know Antonis now plans that we have a general discussion, just everyone can mingle, go and get another drink if you feel like, and just kind of think about the interesting points that we've kind of heard this evening. And of course, if you need to rush off, please feel free to go as well. But yeah, thank you very much. I'm sure we can all welcome, thank Professor Martins with a round of applause. So thank you.